Texas. As we've been covering winter weather, we do know as much of the Northeast digs out from the biggest snowstorm in half a decade. New York, Philadelphia, and Boston could all be on track to see another major system on its heels. But as we've been covering, more than just the Northeast was impacted by snow and frigid temperatures this past weekend. States like Texas still dealing with the impact.
The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it turned predatory. A silent thief stealing the breath from a child's lungs while the world outside remained a crystalline, indifferent tomb. You remember the golden glow of the television screen just hours before, the steady, rhythmic pulse of a leader promising that the darkness was a ghost of the past, a monster slain by billions of dollars and bureaucratic ink. But as the clock struck midnight on this frozen January night in 2026, that pulse flatlined into a terrifying, suffocating void. The unknown architect of this catastrophe sits in a heated office somewhere, staring at flickering green numbers on a monitor, watching as 800,000 heartbeats begin to race in total, freezing darkness. Why did the backup system stay silent while the wind howled like a wounded animal against the siding of your home? There is a secret buried beneath the permafrost of the Texas plains, a truth so disturbing it makes the failures of 2021 look like a dress rehearsal for a much more calculated cruelty. We were told the grid was a fortress, yet here we are, scraping frost off the inside of our own living room windows, wondering which neighbor won't wake up to see the sunrise. The promise wasn't just broken, it was shattered with a precision that suggests someone, somewhere, knew exactly when the breaking point would be reached, and they chose to let the hammer fall anyway. The anatomy of a silent betrayal. The transition from a warm living room to a meat locker happens with a sound that most people mistake for a settling floorboard. A dull, metallic clunk from the exterior breaker box. In the first few minutes of the 2026 freeze, nobody panicked. We were told the grid was a fortress, a multi-billion-dollar shield forged from the lessons of 2021. But as the digital clocks on the ovens flickered and died across 800,000 homes, a different kind of silence took hold. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was the sudden, sharp realization that the air you were breathing was no longer being heated. Somewhere, in a room filled with flickering monitors and the hum of high-end servers, an unknown architect of this disaster watched the frequency of the Texas grid wobble like a dying heart. They didn't hit the emergency button. They didn't issue the warning. They simply watched the pump of the state's energy reserves drain into a black hole of algorithmic greed. In a small apartment in Austin, a terrifyingly plausible scene unfolded. A young father, believing the governor's Thursday promise of total readiness, had neglected to buy extra propane for his space heater. As the indoor temperature dropped to 42 degrees, he huddled with his infant daughter, watching the frost crawl up the nursery walls like skeletal fingers. He checked his phone, desperate for an answer, but the towers were already beginning to fail as the backup batteries froze in the sub-zero wind. This is the pattern interrupt of modern life. The moment you realize the rectangle in your pocket is a brick and the man on the television was a ghost. Who was the unknown person who signed the off-site order to prioritize power for the massive crypto mines on the outskirts of the city, while residential blocks were cut off without a word? The loop stays open, a jagged wound in the public trust, as we realize the localized outages were actually a calculated triage of human life. The story shifts to the frozen highways, where the mind-disturbing reality of the storm met the hubris of the state's emergency planning. 180 million Americans were under alerts, but in Texas, the ice was different. It was a heavy, translucent armor that encased every power line until they snapped with the sound of a gunshot. But why did they snap? Because the winterization we were promised was a cosmetic lie. Records from a shadow whistleblower suggest that the 4,000 inspections ERCOT bragged about were nothing more than drive-by check marks, performed by contractors who never even stepped out of their trucks into the biting wind. The pump of the narrative hits its peak here. The realization that the billions spent were moved from one corporate pocket to another, leaving the physical infrastructure as brittle as a dry bone. As the National Guard was finally deployed, It wasn't to restore power, but to recover what the cold had claimed in the silence of the dark. By Sunday afternoon, the Department of Energy's emergency order was the only thing standing between a nightmare and a total, permanent collapse of the Texas interconnection. The order authorized the deployment of backup generators at data centers, a desperate, high-stakes move that admitted what the governor wouldn't. The grid wasn't holding. It was being held together by duct tape and federal intervention. If the Trump administration had to authorize emergency power from private corporations just to keep the lights on in the state capitol, what chance did a family in a drafty farmhouse have? The storytelling brings us back to the unknown architect, the person who programmed the grid to fail gracefully for the wealthy while leaving the vulnerable to succumb to hypothermia in their own beds. This isn't just a weather report. It's an autopsy of a system that decided some heartbeats weren't worth the cost of the kilowatt. The ghost in the machine. The most chilling part of Winter Storm Fern wasn't the temperature. It was the arithmetic. While millions of Texans watched the ice thicken on their windows, a high-stakes dialogue was occurring in the encrypted channels of energy traders. Accounts from inside the sector suggest that the unknown architect of this chaos wasn't a single person, but an algorithm, a piece of cold, unfeeling code programmed to prioritize the economic health of the grid over the biological health of its citizens. In this mind-disturbing reality, we saw the Department of Energy authorize backup generators not as a safety net for you, but as a life support system for data centers. Why? Because in 2026, data is more valuable than heat. The pump of the narrative reaches its breaking point when you realize that the power was there, it just wasn't for you. It was being diverted to keep the digital world humming while the physical world froze in its tracks. The human cost of this calculation began to surface in the quietest, most horrific ways. In a suburban North Texas neighborhood, 3 young brothers, names kept silent to protect the grieving, slipped through the thin ice of a private pond. It wasn't a grid failure in the traditional sense, but a failure of the safety we were promised. They were out there because the power was out, because the house was a tomb, and because children don't understand that the fortress Governor Abbott spoke of had no walls. Meanwhile, in Frisco, 2 teenagers on a sled were claimed by a tree that had become a jagged spear of ice. These are the mind-disturbing elements that Netflix movies are made of. The realization that when the lights go out, the environment we built to protect us turns into a labyrinth of traps. Every localized outage reported by ERCOT was a localized tragedy, a twist after twist of fate that left 9 Texans dead, while the official press releases spoke of flawless performance. The final betrayal lies in the ambiguity, on purpose, used by those in power. They told us the grid held flawlessly, yet they needed a federal emergency order under Section 202C to authorize the burning of dirty fuel and the use of untapped backup generators just to keep the frequency stable. If the system was so strong, why did it need a last-minute rescue from the Trump administration's DOE? The storytelling reveals a haunting truth. We are living in a permanent state of high-stakes dialogue where every winter is a gamble. The unknown person at the helm knows that as long as the total collapse of 2021 is avoided, they can write off a dozen lives as statistical variances. They hold the loop open, never giving us a straight answer. Because a straight answer would mean admitting that the grid is a house of cards and the wind is picking up. As the ice finally begins to melt on the eaves of the state capitol, the questions remain frozen in the minds of every Texan who sat in the dark. We were told 2021 would never happen again, yet here we are, counting the bodies of children and the hours of lost power. The grid didn't collapse, but the trust did. And in the silence of the aftermath, the most disturbing realization is that Winter Storm Fern was just a warning. The next storm is already forming in the Arctic, and the unknown architects are already recalibrating their algorithms for the next round of triage. If you want to know who is really pulling the switch when the mercury drops, you have to look past the podiums and into the shadows. The grid is strong, they say. But are you safe? Don't let the darkness catch you off guard next time. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications to stay ahead of the next freeze. We're tracking the unknown hands that control your power, and you won't want to miss our next deep dive into the secrets ERCOT doesn't want you to find. Stay warm, stay skeptical, and stay tuned.